December 26, 1996, 5:52 a.m. Patsy Ramsey dials 911, her voice frantic, breathless. "We have a kidnapping. There's a ransom note." But upstairs in the basement of their own Boulder, Colorado mansion, her 6-year-old daughter JonBenet wasn't kidnapped at all. She was already dead. And what police found in those first hours would launch one of the most controversial, most analyzed, and most haunting unsolved cases in American history. This is the story of JonBenét Ramsey, a child beauty queen whose murder inside her own home on Christmas night sparked decades of investigation, countless theories, and a mystery that continues to divide experts to this very day. Because in this case, every answer leads to another question. Every piece of evidence points in a different direction. And the truth, if it exists at all, remains locked somewhere inside the walls of that house. Before we unlock the vault on this investigation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Here at True Crime Vault, we dive deep into the cases that refuse to be forgotten, bringing you detailed investigations every single week. And if you think you know this case, trust me, there are details here that will make you question everything. Drop a like if you're ready to examine the evidence, and let me know in the comments what you think really happened that night. Your theories, your questions, they matter. This case has haunted investigators for almost 3 decades, and today, we're going to examine every piece of evidence, every suspect, every theory. So let's begin. Now, let's go back to the beginning, Boulder, Colorado. December 1996. This wasn't just any American town. Boulder was, and still is, an affluent community nestled against the Rocky Mountains, known for its university, its progressive politics, and its remarkably low crime rate. The kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where children rode bikes freely through tree-lined streets, where violent crime was almost unheard of. Murders in Boulder were extraordinarily rare. In 1996, the city had a population of around 95,000 people, and serious violent crime was virtually non-existent. This was a community that prided itself on safety, education, and quality of life. The Ramsey family fit perfectly into this landscape of prosperity and security. JonBenét Ramsey was a self-made millionaire, the president and CEO of Access Graphics, a computer services company that had recently been valued at over $1 billion. He was 53 years old, a father of 5 children from 2 marriages, respected in the business community, and known as a devoted family man. His first marriage had produced 3 children, and tragically, his eldest daughter Elizabeth had died in a car accident in 1992 at the age of 22. John had experienced devastating loss before, but nothing would prepare him for what was to come. Patsy Ramsey, 40 years old, was his second wife, a former Miss West Virginia who had won her pageant crown in 1977. She was beautiful, poised, and had come from a wealthy family in West Virginia. She had attended West Virginia University, where she met John, and had given up her own ambitions to focus on raising their 2 children and supporting John's career. She was active in their church, involved in charity work, and known throughout Boulder's social circles as a gracious hostess and loving mother. Patsy herself had battled ovarian cancer in 1993, undergoing surgery and treatment, and had been declared cancer-free. She approached life with the vigor of someone who had faced death and won. Their son, Burke, was 9 years old, a quiet boy who loved video games, model trains, and spending time alone with his hobbies. Those who knew him described him as introverted, polite, perhaps a bit socially awkward, but a normal child navigating the complexities of growing up in a wealthy household. And then there was JonBenet Patricia Ramsey, born August 6, 1990. 6 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, a smile that could light up a room. She was already a veteran of the child pageant circuit, having competed in dozens of beauty pageants across the country. She had won titles like Little Miss Colorado, National Tiny Miss Beauty, and Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl. Her mother had introduced her to pageants when she was just 4 years old, channeling her own pageant experience into her daughter's burgeoning career. JonBenet seemed to love the attention, the costumes, the performances. Videos showed her singing, dancing, strutting across stages with confidence far beyond her years, wearing makeup, wigs, and elaborate costumes that made her look years older. To some, she was a talented child living her dream, encouraged by a supportive mother who wanted to give her daughter opportunities. To others, she was a child being exploited, sexualized, put on display in a world that no 6-year-old should inhabit. The pageant culture itself became a focal point of criticism after her death, with many arguing that it made JonBenet a target, that her image had been broadcast too widely, making her vulnerable to predators. This debate continues to this day. The Ramsey home was a Tudor-style mansion on 15th Street in Boulder, a sprawling 7,000-square-foot residence with 15 rooms spread across 3 floors and a basement. It was purchased in 1991 for just under $500,000 and was the kind of house that required staff to maintain. The layout was complex, almost maze-like, with multiple staircases, hallways, and rooms tucked into odd corners. The basement alone was a labyrinth of storage spaces, a boiler room, a train room where Burke kept his elaborate model train set, and a small wine cellar with a heavy wooden door. The family employed a housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, who came several times a week to clean, do laundry, and help with household tasks. Linda knew the house intimately, knew where things were kept, had keys to enter when the family wasn't home. She was familiar with the family's routines, their schedules, their habits. This detail would become important later, as investigators considered whether someone with inside knowledge could have planned the crime. Christmas Day, 1996, was by all accounts a normal, happy day for the Ramseys. They spent the morning at home, opening presents around their large Christmas tree in the living room. JonBenet received a bicycle, which she rode briefly inside the house, much to Patsy's amusement. Burke got video games and gadgets. The family had a light lunch, enjoyed each other's company, and prepared for the evening's activities. In the afternoon, the family visited friends, the Whites, for a brief visit, then returned home to prepare for the main event of the evening, a Christmas party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends of the Ramseys. The party was a large gathering, filled with laughter, food, holiday cheer, and children running through the house playing games. JonBenet wore a black velvet outfit with a red turtleneck underneath, looking every bit the little lady her mother had raised her to be. She played with other children, ate party food, and seemed to be having a wonderful time. Burke stayed close to the adults, as was his habit, occasionally playing with other kids but mostly keeping to himself. The family left the party around 9:30 p.m. and drove the short distance back home. According to John and Patsy, both children were exhausted from the long day of excitement and celebration. They claimed that JonBenet fell asleep in the car during the drive home, her head resting against the car door, completely knocked out. John carried her inside, up the stairs, and directly to her bedroom on the 2nd floor. She was still wearing the outfit from the party, the black velvet pants and the red turtleneck. Patsy said she helped change JonBenet into pajamas, a pair of oversized white long johns and a white Gap shirt that was far too big for her small frame, without fully waking her. This was a routine they had perfected, Patsy explained. JonBenet was a deep sleeper, and they could change her clothes without disturbing her rest. Burke, they said, went straight to his room and to bed as well. The family was scheduled to fly early the next morning, December 26th, from a private airstrip to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan, and then continue to a Disney cruise they had planned for the holidays. Everything needed to be ready. John and Patsy prepared for the trip, setting out clothes for the morning, packing last-minute items, making sure everything was in order. They said they were in bed by around 10 p.m., maybe a bit later. The house had a sophisticated security system with motion detectors and alarms, but according to the Ramseys, they forgot to activate it that night. This was not unusual, they claimed. They felt safe in Boulder. They felt safe in their home. They had never had any security incidents, never felt threatened. Why would they? This was one of the safest communities in America. By 10:30 p.m., the lights in the Ramsey house were off. The street outside was quiet, blanketed in snow, a picturesque scene of suburban Christmas tranquility. And somewhere in those dark, silent hours between 10 p.m. and dawn, someone murdered JonBenet Ramsey. 5:52 a.m., December 26th. Patsy Ramsey, according to her account, woke early to prepare for the trip. She came downstairs, still wearing the same red and black velvet outfit she had worn the night before. She hadn't changed, she said, because she planned to change just before leaving for the airport. As she descended the spiral staircase from the 2nd floor to the 1st, she noticed something odd. 3 sheets of white paper, lined notebook paper, laid out neatly on one of the lower steps. She picked them up and began to read. The words made her blood run cold. "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business but not the country that it serves. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession." Patsy screamed, a guttural, primal scream that tore through the quiet morning. She dropped the note, her hands shaking, and ran upstairs to JonBenet's bedroom. The door was open. The bed was empty, the pink blankets pulled back, disturbed. JonBenet was gone. Patsy ran to Burke's room. He was there in his bed, apparently still asleep. She screamed for John, who came running from their bedroom, confused, alarmed. Together they scanned the note again, their hands trembling, their hearts racing. The note demanded money, exactly $118,000 in cash. It threatened JonBenet's life if they contacted police, if they told anyone, if they didn't follow the instructions precisely. But Patsy, in a panic, in a state of terror that no parent should ever experience, did exactly what the note told her not to do. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. The 911 call, recorded and later released to the public, captured those first terrifying moments. The call came in at 5:52 a.m. Patsy's voice was high-pitched, frantic, barely coherent. "We have a kidnapping, hurry please." The operator, a woman trying to stay calm and professional, asked her to slow down, to explain what was happening. "Explain to me what's going on, okay?" Patsy's breathing was rapid, gasping. "There's a ransom note here." Her voice cracked, breaking with desperation. The operator asked who took her daughter. "I don't know. I just found a note." She sounded like she was on the verge of complete hysteria. The operator asked if JonBenet was anywhere in the house. "No, I don't know." Patsy's voice rose, almost screaming. The operator tried to keep her focused, asking questions, gathering information, dispatching police to the address. At the end of the call, there's a moment that has been analyzed endlessly by audio experts, investigators, and armchair detectives around the world. Patsy seems to think she has hung up the phone, but the line is still open. For a few seconds, voices can be heard in the background, muffled but present. Some audio experts, using enhancement technology, claim to hear 3 distinct voices. John's voice, allegedly saying something like, "We're not speaking to you," in an angry or frustrated tone. Patsy's voice, different from the panicked tone on the 911 call, sounding more controlled. And a child's voice, possibly Burke, asking, "What did you find?" or "What did they find?" This snippet, these few seconds of unclear audio, has been interpreted in 1,000 different ways. If Burke was awake and downstairs asking questions, why did the Ramseys later tell police that he had slept through the entire ordeal until they woke him much later in the morning? Was this innocuous? A child waking up to the commotion and asking what was happening? Or was it significant, suggesting that Burke was already awake and involved in the events of that morning? The debate has raged for decades, with experts on both sides claiming certainty about what the audio reveals. The truth remains ambiguous. Officer Rick French arrived at the Ramsey home at 5:59 a.m., exactly 7 minutes after the 911 call. He was a patrol officer, responding to what dispatch had told him was a possible kidnapping in progress. He entered the home, where John and Patsy met him at the door, both visibly distraught. Patsy was crying, shaking. John was trying to maintain composure but clearly terrified. Officer French immediately began a visual sweep of the premises, looking for signs of forced entry, points of access, anything that might tell him how a kidnapper had entered and exited with a child. He checked windows on the main floor, all locked. He checked doors. The front door had been unlocked when he arrived, but that was because the Ramseys had opened it for him. The back door was locked. The side door was locked. He moved through the house, noting the expensive furnishings, the holiday decorations still up, the normal appearance of a wealthy family's home. He checked the garage. Nothing unusual. He descended into the basement, navigating the maze of rooms. The basement was dimly lit, cold, cluttered with storage boxes and household items. French checked the boiler room, where the furnace hummed quietly. He checked the storage areas, filled with Christmas decorations, old furniture, boxes of family belongings. He moved to the train room, where Burke's elaborate model train set was displayed on a large table. And then he approached a small white door, secured with a simple wooden block latch. This was the wine cellar, a small room where the Ramseys kept a few bottles of wine and some storage items. Officer French pulled the wooden block up, opened the door, and peered inside. The room was pitch black. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't step inside. He saw nothing in the darkness and moved on, closing the door behind him. This decision, this single moment of standard procedure that seemed reasonable at the time, would haunt Officer French for the rest of his life. Because JonBenet was in that room, her body was lying on the floor, just a few feet from where he stood. If he had turned on the light, if he had stepped inside, the entire investigation would have unfolded differently. But he didn't. He closed the door and continued his sweep, finding nothing suspicious elsewhere. French returned upstairs and reported his findings to the detectives who were now arriving on scene. No obvious signs of a break-in, no sign of the child. The house appeared secure. This was being treated as a kidnapping, and the protocols for a kidnapping investigation began to unfold. Detective Linda Arndt arrived shortly after and assumed command of the scene. She was an experienced investigator, but this was unlike anything she had encountered before. A child kidnapped from her own home on Christmas night, with a bizarre ransom note left behind. She began coordinating with other officers, setting up a command post, preparing for the ransom call that the note said would come. But within the first hour, the crime scene, if it even was a crime scene, began to be compromised in ways that would have catastrophic consequences for the investigation. John Ramsey, in his panic and desperation, started making phone calls. He called his pilot to cancel their flight. He called close friends, asking them to come over, to provide support. Patsy, nearly hysterical, was being comforted by a victim advocate from the police department. By 7 a.m., the house was filling with people. Fleet and Priscilla White arrived. John and Barbara Fernie, another couple close to the Ramseys, came rushing over. Reverend Roll Hoverstock from St. John's Episcopal Church, where the Ramseys were members, arrived to provide spiritual comfort. Friends brought food, made coffee, tried to create some sense of normalcy in the midst of chaos. Within 2 hours of the 911 call, there were more than a dozen people inside the house, walking through rooms, touching surfaces, sitting on furniture, using the phone, moving objects. From a forensic standpoint, it was a disaster. The crime scene, the sanctity of the evidence, was being contaminated by the minute. But at the time, everyone believed this was a kidnapping. The child wasn't in the house. The focus was on supporting the family and preparing for contact from the kidnappers. No one yet understood that JonBenet was already dead in the basement, that this was a murder scene, that every person walking through those rooms was potentially destroying evidence that could solve the case. Detective Arndt positioned herself with the family, waiting for the ransom call. The note had specified that the kidnappers would call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. with instructions for delivering the money. John Ramsey, following the note's demands, made arrangements to withdraw $118,000 from his bank. He gathered the money, put it in a bag, and waited. Everyone waited. The phone sat silent. 8 a.m. came and went. No call. The tension in the room was unbearable. Patsy sat surrounded by friends, weeping, praying, clutching photos of JonBenet. John paced, checked his watch, stared at the phone. 9 a.m. Still nothing. Detective Arndt began to feel a growing sense of unease. Something was wrong. Kidnappers who leave ransom notes call. They demand their money. They give instructions. But these kidnappers, whoever they were, weren't calling. 10 a.m. The deadline mentioned in the note passed. Still no contact from any kidnapper. The silence was deafening. Detective Arndt's instincts told her this was not a typical kidnapping. The note was too long, too strange, too theatrical. Real kidnappers don't write 2.5-page ransom notes with movie references and bizarre sign-offs. They want money, they want it fast, and they communicate clearly and quickly. This note felt wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. Around 1 p.m., with no new leads, no phone calls, and a house full of anxious people, Detective Arndt made a decision that would change everything. She asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to conduct another search of the house, top to bottom, to see if they could find anything that had been overlooked, anything that might provide a clue. This was unusual. Crime scenes are typically secured and searched methodically by trained officers, not by family members and friends. But Arndt later explained that she was trying to keep John occupied, to give him something to do, to prevent him from spiraling into complete despair. She could not have known what this decision would unleash. John Ramsey and Fleet White started on the top floor of the house and worked their way down, searching systematically. They checked bedrooms, looked in closets, examined bathrooms, opened doors. They moved to the main floor, then descended into the basement. The basement was cold, the air heavy and still. They looked in the boiler room. Nothing. They checked the storage areas. Nothing unusual. They moved to the train room where Burke's train sat undisturbed. And then John walked toward the wine cellar, the small room with the white wooden door that Officer French had opened briefly that morning without turning on the light. John pulled the wooden latch up, grasped the door handle, and pulled the door open. He reached inside, found the light switch, and flipped it on. The light illuminated the small windowless room, approximately 12 by 14 feet. And there, on the white concrete floor, partially covered by a white blanket, was JonBenet. Her small body lay on its back, her arms raised stiffly above her head, frozen in rigor mortis. A piece of black duct tape covered her mouth. A white nylon cord was wrapped tightly around her neck, tied in a complex knot with a broken wooden stick, later identified as part of a paintbrush handle from Patsy's art supplies, twisted into the cord to form a garrote. The stick had been used to tighten the cord, strangling her. She was wearing a white Gap shirt, far too large for her small frame, pulled up slightly, exposing her torso. She was wearing white long johns, also oversized. On one wrist was a small gold bracelet, a piece of jewelry she often wore. Her blonde hair was matted, tangled. Her skin was pale, waxy, with areas of discoloration that indicated she had been dead for many hours. Her eyes were partially open, her face frozen in an expression that would haunt everyone who saw her. John Ramsey let out a sound that Fleetwhite would later describe as something he had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. A guttural, anguished scream, a sound of pure agony that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. John rushed into the room, ripped the duct tape from JonBenet's mouth with his bare hands, scooped up her rigid body and carried her upstairs. Fleetwhite followed close behind, trying to stop him, realizing that this was a crime scene, that the body should not be moved, that evidence was being destroyed. But John was beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond any ability to think clearly. He was a father carrying his dead child. Nothing else mattered. He brought her up the basement stairs, through the hallway, into the living room, near the Christmas tree that still stood decorated in the corner, and laid her on the floor. Detective Arndt saw him emerge from the basement, JonBenet's small body in his arms, and she knew immediately. The child was dead, had been dead for hours. Rigor mortis had already set in fully, indicating that death had occurred many hours earlier, sometime in the night. Arndt instructed John to lay JonBenet down on the floor and step back. She needed to preserve what was left of the scene, though she knew it was already too late. Patsy, hearing the commotion, came into the room and saw her daughter's body. She collapsed, wailing, a sound of grief so profound that everyone in the house would remember it for the rest of their lives. She threw herself over JonBenet's body, sobbing, screaming, calling her daughter's name. Friends tried to pull her away to give the police space, but Patsy was inconsolable. John knelt nearby, his face blank, his eyes staring at nothing, in complete shock. The scene was chaos, grief, horror, and from a forensic perspective, it was irreparably compromised. The body had been moved from its original position. The duct tape had been removed and discarded. Multiple people had touched the body, the blanket, the area around the crime scene. Evidence had been disturbed, altered, contaminated. The most critical moments of a murder investigation, the preservation of the scene in its original state, had been lost. Detective Arndt called for backup, for the coroner, for the entire investigative apparatus of the Boulder Police Department. The house was now officially a murder scene. Burke Ramsey, who had been kept upstairs and away from the unfolding horror, was quickly taken to the Fleetwhite family's home to shield him from what had happened. John and Patsy were separated, moved to different areas of the house, as investigators began to process the scene and gather preliminary evidence. The coroner arrived and made an initial assessment. JonBenet had clearly been dead for many hours. Based on the state of rigor mortis and the body's temperature, time of death was estimated to be sometime between 10 p.m. on December 25th and 2 a.m. on December 26th. The cause of death appeared to be strangulation, evidenced by the ligature around her neck and the visible signs of asphyxiation. But there was also clear evidence of head trauma. The investigation was just beginning, and already, the complexity and horror of what had happened were becoming apparent. The autopsy was performed the following day, December 27th, by Dr. John Meyer, the Boulder County coroner at Boulder Community Hospital. What he discovered during that autopsy would shock even seasoned investigators and would become the subject of intense scrutiny, debate, and controversy for decades to come. Dr. Meyer's findings were detailed and disturbing. JonBenet had died from asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In simpler terms, she had suffered two catastrophic injuries: a massive blow to the head and strangulation by ligature. Either injury alone could have been fatal. Together, they painted a picture of violence that was almost incomprehensible when directed at a 6-year-old child. The head injury was severe. There was an 8.5-inch linear skull fracture running from the right side of her head toward the back. The fracture was deep, extending through the full thickness of the skull bone. Beneath the fracture, there was extensive hemorrhaging in the brain tissue, indicating that her heart had still been beating when the injury occurred. The force required to cause such a fracture was tremendous, equivalent to being struck with a heavy object like a baseball bat or a golf club, or falling from a significant height onto a hard surface. Yet remarkably, there was very little external evidence of this injury. No significant bruising on the scalp, no open wound, no blood. The blow had been delivered with enough force to crack her skull, but had not broken the skin. This detail would lead to questions about what object was used and whether the injury had been immediately fatal, or if JonBenet had survived for some period of time after being struck. The strangulation was equally brutal. A white nylon cord, approximately 1/4 inch in diameter, had been wrapped around her neck and tightened using a garrote mechanism. The garrote consisted of the cord tied to a broken wooden stick, later identified as part of a paintbrush from Patsy Ramsey's art supplies kept in the basement. The stick had been twisted, tightening the cord around JonBenet's neck until it cut deeply into her skin, creating a furrow that measured 1/4 to 1/2 inch in depth. There were petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, small blood vessels that had burst due to the pressure and lack of oxygen, a clear sign of asphyxiation. Her tongue showed signs of swelling and protrusion, also consistent with strangulation. The level of violence required to strangle someone, especially a small child, is significant. This was not a quick or accidental death. Someone had deliberately constructed this garrote, placed it around her neck, and tightened it until she died. Dr. Meyer also noted ligature marks on JonBenet's right wrist, where another piece of white cord had been loosely tied. The cord on her wrist was not tight, not functional in any restraining sense. Some investigators believed this was part of the staging, an attempt to make it look like she had been bound by an intruder. The cord appeared to have been placed after death or very near the time of death, as there was minimal trauma or reaction in the skin. There were abrasions on her body, small scratches on her back, a triangular mark on her left shoulder, linear marks on her lower back that some investigators believed could have been caused by a stun gun, though this theory was highly controversial and never proven. No stun gun was ever found, and experts disagreed on whether the marks were consistent with such a device. And then there were the injuries that suggested possible sexual assault, findings that would become some of the most debated and controversial aspects of the case. Dr. Meyer noted evidence of chronic inflammation in the vaginal area, which some experts interpreted as signs of prior abuse. There was also acute injury, fresh trauma, consistent with recent violation. However, the autopsy language was careful, noting that the findings could be interpreted in multiple ways and that definitive conclusions about sexual assault were difficult. Some medical examiners who reviewed the autopsy findings believed the evidence clearly indicated ongoing sexual abuse. Others argued that the findings could be explained by other factors, including normal anatomical variations, irritation from bubble baths, or innocent touching. The debate among medical professionals has never been fully resolved, leaving this aspect of the case shrouded in uncertainty. In JonBenet's stomach and upper intestine, pathologists found partially digested pineapple. Based on the state of digestion and the movement through her digestive system, forensic experts estimated she had eaten this pineapple approximately 2 to 3 hours before her death. If death occurred around midnight, that would mean she had eaten the pineapple around 9 or 10 p.m. But according to John and Patsy Ramsey, JonBenet had fallen asleep in the car on the way home from the Christmas party around 9:30 p.m. and had been carried directly to bed without waking. She had not eaten anything after returning home. So how did fresh pineapple end up in her stomach? This seemingly small detail would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case, because police, during their initial search of the house on the morning of December 26th, had found a white bowl on the kitchen table containing chunks of pineapple in liquid, along with a large serving spoon. The bowl was sitting there, seemingly forgotten, as if someone had been eating from it recently. Crime scene technicians processed the bowl for fingerprints and found 2 clear prints, one from Patsy Ramsey and one from Burke Ramsey. This evidence suggested that at some point after arriving home from the party, JonBenet had been in the kitchen, awake, and had eaten pineapple from that bowl. But the Ramseys insisted this was impossible. They offered various explanations. Perhaps the bowl had been left out from earlier in the day, perhaps from breakfast or lunch. Perhaps JonBenet had gotten up during the night on her own and eaten the pineapple without anyone knowing. Perhaps the pineapple in her stomach was from the party, though no one at the party remembered serving pineapple, and the digestive timeline didn't support that theory. The pineapple became a symbol of the contradictions and inconsistencies that plagued this case. It was a simple, verifiable fact. JonBenet had eaten fresh pineapple shortly before her death, but that fact didn't fit with the family's account of that night. It meant someone wasn't telling the whole truth. It meant something had happened that the Ramseys either didn't know about or weren't acknowledging, and it meant the timeline of that night, the last hours of JonBenet's life, was not what it appeared to be. Now let's talk about the ransom note in detail, because this single piece of evidence may be the most analyzed, debated, and scrutinized document in the history of American criminal investigations. The note was discovered by Patsy Ramsey on the spiral staircase at 5:52 a.m., just before she called 911. It consisted of 3 pages of white-lined paper, the kind found in a standard legal pad. The paper came from a notepad that was kept in the Ramsey kitchen near the telephone. The pen used to write the note was also from the house, a black Sharpie marker that belonged to the family. What made this note extraordinary wasn't just its length, though at 2.5 pages it was unusually long for a ransom demand. What made it extraordinary was its content, its tone, its bizarre mixture of formality and colloquialism, its references to movies and pop culture, and the fact that it appeared to have been written by someone with intimate knowledge of the Ramsey family and their finances. The note began with a formal, almost businesslike tone. "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. Note the misspelling of possession with 1 S instead of 2. This would be one of many details analyzed by handwriting experts and linguistic specialists." The note continued. "She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter." The reference to seeing 1997 was curious, given that it was only 5 days away. It suggested either genuine kidnappers working on a tight timeline or someone trying to sound like a kidnapper and reaching for dramatic language. Then came the ransom demand. "You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. The money should be put in a brown paper bag. Make sure that you bring an adequate size attaché to the bank." The amount was extraordinarily specific, exactly $118,000. Not a round number like 100,000 or 200,000. Not $1 million, which might be expected from someone targeting a millionaire businessman. But 118,000, which happened to be the exact amount of John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus from Access Graphics. How would an outsider know that number? John's bonus was not public information. It wasn't something discussed outside the family. The specificity of this amount suggested someone with inside knowledge of the Ramsey family's finances, either someone very close to them or someone who had access to their financial documents. The note continued with detailed instructions and threats. "When you get home, you will put the money in a brown paper bag. I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an earlier delivery of the money, and hence an earlier pickup of your daughter." The language here was strange. Hence an earlier pickup was awkward phrasing, grammatically incorrect. "The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested," sounded almost considerate, oddly polite for a kidnapper making death threats. The tone was inconsistent, shifting between harsh demands and strange courtesies. Then came the threats, which read like dialogue from an action movie. "Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded. Beheaded. The word was shocking, theatrical, over the top. Real kidnappers might threaten to kill their victim, but beheaded sounded like something from a movie or a novel. The reference to the two gentlemen watching over your daughter suggested multiple kidnappers, a group effort, though the note switched between I and we inconsistently throughout. The note continued, "If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. You will be scanned for electronic devices, and if any are found, she dies." The phrase, "talking to a stray dog," was bizarre, almost comical in its absurdity. It didn't sound like the language a real kidnapper would use. It sounded like someone trying to sound threatening but reaching for dramatic, exaggerated phrases. The repetition of "she dies" created a rhythm, almost like a script. Near the end, the note shifted tone again. "You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Follow our instructions, and you stand a 100% chance of getting her back. You and your family are under constant scrutiny as well as the authorities. Don't try to grow a brain, John. You're not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be difficult. Don't underestimate us, John. Use that good Southern common sense of yours. It is up to you now, John." The repeated use of John's first name, the phrase, "don't try to grow a brain," the reference to good Southern common sense, all suggested a personal familiarity with John Ramsey. The fat cat comment referenced his wealth, but in a way that felt personal, almost resentful. And the sign-off was perhaps the strangest part of all. Victory, SBTC. Victory. What did that mean in the context of a ransom demand? And SBTC. Those four letters have never been definitively explained. Investigators and amateur sleuths have proposed hundreds of theories. Saved by the Cross, a religious reference. Subic Bay Training Center, a military connection. Santa Barbara Tennis Club, some group or organization with those initials. Or perhaps just random letters meant to sound official and mysterious. No one knows. The note's language contained references that seemed to come from movies. The phrase, "don't try to grow a brain," echoed dialogue from the film Dirty Harry. The overall tone and structure resembled the ransom notes in films like Ransom and Speed, both popular action movies from the mid-1990s. It was as if someone had watched kidnapping movies and tried to replicate the language and tone. After the note was found, investigators discovered something even more telling. In the same notepad from which the ransom note pages were torn, police found practice versions on earlier pages. Someone had started writing a ransom note, begun with Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, then stopped, torn out those pages, and started again with just Mr. Ramsey. This suggested the note had been drafted and redrafted, that the writer had taken time to compose it, to get it right. Writing this note, from the practice versions to the final 2.5-page letter, would have taken significant time. Handwriting experts estimated anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, possibly longer if the writer was being careful to disguise their handwriting. Think about that. Someone sat in the Ramsey house in the middle of the night after a child had been murdered, and calmly spent 20 or 30 minutes writing and rewriting a ransom note. If this was an intruder who had just committed murder, why not flee immediately? Why take such an enormous risk, staying in the house, using materials from the house, crafting this elaborate note? And after finishing the note, the writer returned the notepad to its proper place in the kitchen and put the Sharpie pen back where it belonged. This wasn't the behavior of a panicked criminal fleeing a murder scene. This was someone comfortable in the house, someone who knew where things belonged, someone who had time. Handwriting analysis became crucial. Patsy Ramsey was asked to provide handwriting samples multiple times under various conditions. John provided samples. Other people with access to the house provided samples. The results were maddeningly inconclusive. Some experts said the handwriting was consistent with Patsy's, particularly the way certain letters were formed, the looping of the lowercase l, the formation of the letter A. Other experts said the handwriting definitively did not match Patsy, that the letter formations were different enough to exclude her. The Ramsey defense team hired their own experts who concluded that Patsy did not write the note. The Boulder police hired experts who said she could have written it. Some experts said John could have written it in a disguised hand. Others said it was impossible to determine authorship with certainty. The debate has never been resolved, leaving the ransom note as both a crucial piece of evidence and a source of endless frustration. But consider the implications. If someone in the Ramsey family wrote this note, it represents an elaborate staging designed to point investigators away from the family and toward a fictional group of kidnappers. If an intruder wrote it, it represents one of the most bizarre and risky decisions a criminal has ever made, staying in a victim's house after a murder to write a lengthy theatrical ransom note that would never result in a ransom call. Either scenario seems almost impossible, yet one of them must be true. The investigation now turned fully to the question that would define this case for decades. Who killed JonBenet Ramsey? And the first, most obvious place investigators looked was the family itself. Statistically, when a child is murdered, especially a child murdered in their own home, the perpetrator is almost always someone the child knows intimately. More than 80% of child murders are committed by family members or close family friends. The Boulder Police Department, under enormous public pressure to solve this high-profile case, focused their investigation heavily on John and Patsy Ramsey, and to a lesser extent on 9-year-old Burke. The theory that emerged in law enforcement circles went something like this. Something happened in the house that night. Possibly an accident. Possibly a moment of rage. Possibly something more sinister. JonBenet was struck on the head, causing the massive skull fracture. One or both parents, finding their daughter gravely injured or already dead, made a split-second decision to stage the scene rather than call for help. They created the garrote to make it look like a sexual predator. They wrote the elaborate ransom note to point investigators toward fictional kidnappers. They called 911 the next morning, hoping the body would not be found immediately, giving them time to establish an alibi and distance themselves from the crime. Supporters of this theory pointed to numerous pieces of evidence. First and foremost, there was no clear sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. Every window was either locked or, in the case of the basement window that John had broken months earlier, showed no recent signs of use. Every door was locked except the ones the family normally used. The sophisticated security system, capable of detecting motion and intrusion, had not been activated, but how would an intruder know that? The layout of the house itself presented challenges for the intruder theory. The house was enormous, 15 rooms spread across multiple floors, with a complex layout that even frequent visitors found confusing. How did an intruder navigate this house in the dark? Locate JonBenet's bedroom on the second floor, take her to the basement without waking anyone, find Patsy's art supplies to create the garrote, and then sit down to write a ransom note using materials from the kitchen. Second, there were fibers. This became one of the most damning pieces of forensic evidence against Patsy Ramsey. Crime scene technicians found fibers consistent with Patsy's red and black jacket, the jacket she wore on Christmas night, in 2 critical locations: on the duct tape covering JonBenet's mouth and entwined in the knot of the garrote cord. How did Patsy's jacket fibers get onto the duct tape and into the garrote if she had simply put JonBenet to bed at 10 p.m. and never saw her again? The defense argued that these could be transfer fibers, that Patsy had held and touched JonBenet throughout the day, that fibers could have been on JonBenet's body or clothing and were transferred to the duct tape and cord when those items came into contact with her. But prosecutors found this explanation weak. The fibers were entwined in the knot itself, suggesting direct contact between Patsy's jacket and the cord during or after the knot was tied. John's fibers were also found. Fibers consistent with his black shirt were found in JonBenet's genital area and on the inside of the underwear she was found wearing. John claimed he had helped dress JonBenet for bed that night, which could explain the transfer. But some investigators found the location of the fibers suspicious, suggesting contact during or after the injuries to her genital area. Third, there was the ransom amount. $118,000, exactly matching John's bonus, suggested inside knowledge that only family or very close friends would have. Fourth, there was the behavior of the Ramseys themselves, which some investigators interpreted as suspicious. Within hours of finding JonBenet's body, the Ramseys were surrounded by lawyers. They hired a prominent criminal defense attorney, Hal Haddon, and a high-powered legal team. They refused to sit for separate, formal interviews with police for 4 months. When they finally agreed to be interviewed in April 1997, it was on their terms, together rather than separately with their attorneys present. with conditions about what could and couldn't be asked. To some investigators, this looked like the behavior of guilty people hiding behind lawyers. Why wouldn't innocent parents desperate to find their daughter's killer cooperate fully and immediately with police? Why lawyer up if you have nothing to hide? The Ramseys had a different perspective. They argued that from the very beginning, the Boulder police had decided they were guilty and were conducting a biased investigation designed to build a case against them rather than find the real killer. They pointed to leaks to the media, to the adversarial tone of police questioning, to the fact that they were being treated as suspects rather than grieving parents. Their attorneys advised them that speaking to police without legal protection would be dangerous, that anything they said would be twisted and used against them. They were protecting themselves, they argued, from a police department that had already convicted them in their minds. This fundamental divide, the police believing the Ramseys were guilty and uncooperative, the Ramseys believing the police were biased and incompetent, poisoned the investigation from the start and created a dynamic that persists to this day. And then there was Burke, the 9-year-old boy who was in the house that night, who slept through everything according to his parents, whose fingerprints were on the glass next to the bowl of pineapple. Some investigators began to theorize an accidental killing by Burke, with the parents staging a cover-up to protect their only surviving child. This theory suggested that Burke, perhaps in a moment of sibling conflict or childhood rage, could have struck JonBenet with an object, causing the massive head wound. Finding their daughter gravely injured or dying, John and Patsy made the agonizing decision to protect Burke. They couldn't call for help because it would implicate their son. So they staged an elaborate kidnapping, created the garrote to explain the death, wrote the ransom note, and called police the next morning, hoping to create enough confusion and misdirection to prevent investigators from discovering what really happened. This theory gained significant traction after a 2016 CBS documentary called The Case of JonBenet Ramsey featured a panel of experts, including former FBI profilers, forensic scientists, and investigators who systematically worked through the evidence and concluded that Burke was the most likely person to have delivered the fatal head blow, with the parents covering it up. The documentary created a media firestorm and led Burke Ramsey, then 29 years old, to file a massive defamation lawsuit against CBS and the production company, seeking $650 million in damages. The case was eventually settled in 2019 for an undisclosed sum, allowing Burke to move forward with a legal vindication, though the court of public opinion remained deeply divided. Burke has always, consistently, absolutely denied any involvement in his sister's death. In 2016, he gave his first and only major public interview to Dr. Phil McGraw, appearing on camera for the first time in 20 years to tell his side of the story. The interview was controversial. Burke appeared nervous, sometimes smiling or even laughing at moments that seemed inappropriate, which fueled speculation about his mental state and possible guilt. But child psychologists and trauma experts noted that awkward affect, including inappropriate smiling, can be a nervous response, especially for someone who has lived under the most intense public scrutiny imaginable for 2 decades. Burke stated clearly and unequivocally that he did not kill his sister, that he loved JonBenet, that he had nothing to do with her death, and that the accusations against him were categorically false. John and Patsy Ramsey maintained their innocence from the first moment and never wavered. They insisted that an intruder killed their daughter, that the police were too focused on the family to properly investigate other leads, that crucial evidence pointing to an outsider was being ignored or downplayed. And they pointed to evidence that, they argued, definitively proved an intruder's involvement. The most significant piece of evidence supporting the intruder theory is DNA. And this is where the case takes another turn into complexity and controversy. In 1997, forensic scientists with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation analyzed JonBenet's clothing, specifically the underwear she was found wearing and the long johns. They discovered DNA from an unknown male. This DNA, a mixture of blood and saliva, was found in the crotch area of the underwear, mixed with JonBenet's blood from the vaginal injuries noted in the autopsy. The DNA profile was that of a male, but it did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. Not John, not Burke, not any male friend or relative who had access to the house. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scenes across the country. The unknown male DNA has never matched anyone in the database. For more than 25 years, this DNA profile has sat in CODIS, waiting for a match that has never come. In 2003, the Boulder District Attorney's Office, frustrated with the lack of progress and believing the DNA was key to solving the case, sent the evidence to Bode Technology Group, a private laboratory in Virginia that specializes in advanced DNA analysis. Using cutting-edge techniques, including a method called touch DNA that can recover DNA from skin cells left on fabric through simple contact, Bode confirmed the presence of the same unknown male DNA profile on the waistband of the long johns JonBenet was wearing. This was significant. The same male DNA profile appeared in 2 different locations on 2 different pieces of clothing. This suggested to some investigators and to the Ramsey defense team that this DNA came from JonBenet's killer, that it was deposited during the assault and murder, and that identifying this individual would solve the case. In 2008, Mary Lacey, who had been elected Boulder District Attorney in 2001, took an extraordinary and controversial step. Based on the DNA evidence and new analysis suggesting the DNA was likely deposited during the crime, she sent a letter to John Ramsey officially exonerating him, Patsy, who had died 2 years earlier, and Burke of any involvement in JonBenet's murder. The letter was a public apology, acknowledging the years of suspicion, the media scrutiny, and the pain the family had endured. Lacey stated that the DNA evidence pointed conclusively to an intruder, and that the Ramsey family deserved to have their reputations restored. This exoneration was explosive and deeply divisive. Many investigators who had worked the case for years, including detectives from the Boulder Police Department and prosecutors from the District Attorney's Office under previous administrations, disagreed vehemently with Lacey's decision. They argued that the DNA evidence was far from conclusive, that it could be explained in other ways, and that exonerating the family based solely on this evidence was premature and wrong. The controversy centered on the nature of the DNA itself. The DNA found in the underwear was minuscule in quantity, described as trace DNA. It could have been deposited during the manufacturing process at the factory where the underwear was made, or at the store where it was sold, or by anyone who handled the garment before it was worn. The underwear was brand new, taken from a package of multiple pairs that Patsy had purchased shortly before Christmas. There is no way to know definitively when or how that DNA was deposited. The DNA on the long johns was even more problematic from an evidentiary standpoint. It was touch DNA, incredibly small amounts that can be transferred through casual, innocent contact. Studies have shown that touch DNA can be transferred through multiple degrees of separation. For example, if person A shakes hands with person B, and person B then touches person C, person A's DNA can end up on person C without person A ever having direct contact. DNA transfer is complex, often unpredictable, and difficult to interpret in a forensic context. Some DNA experts hired by the defense and by the district attorney's office argued that the presence of the same DNA profile in 2 locations made innocent transfer less likely, that it suggested direct contact during the crime. Others, including experts hired by the Boulder police and by prosecutors, argued that the DNA could easily have been transferred innocently, that its presence proved nothing about the identity of the killer, and that focusing exclusively on this DNA was leading the investigation astray. So the DNA evidence, rather than solving the case, became another source of division and debate. Is it the key to finding JonBenet's killer? Or is it a misleading red herring that has distracted from other evidence? But let's fully explore the intruder theory, because there is evidence beyond the DNA that suggests someone from outside the family could have been responsible. First, there's physical evidence that has never been explained. Near JonBenet's body in the wine cellar, crime scene technicians found a boot print, specifically a high-tech brand hiking boot print that did not match any footwear belonging to anyone in the Ramsey family. The print was photographed and documented, but its origin was never determined. Whose boot was it? Could it have belonged to one of the police officers or crime scene technicians who processed the basement? Possibly, but none of them recalled wearing high-tech boots, and the brand didn't match standard-issue police footwear. Second, there's an unidentified palm print found on the wine cellar door, the door that led to the room where JonBenet's body was found. This partial palm print did not match anyone in the Ramsey family, nor did it match anyone who had legitimate access to the house. It was entered into print databases but has never been matched to any known individual. Who left that print? When was it left? These questions have never been answered. Third, There's the basement window. While the window had been broken months earlier by John Ramsey, and there were spider webs in the window frame that suggested it hadn't been used recently, it's at least theoretically possible that an intruder could have entered through this window carefully without disturbing the webs. Near the window, investigators found a hard-sided suitcase positioned oddly against the wall, directly beneath the window. The suitcase did not normally sit in that location. On top of the suitcase was a small piece of glass from the broken window pane. Some investigators believe the intruder used the suitcase as a step stool to reach the window and climb out after the murder. Inside the suitcase, police found a comforter that contained fibers and a small amount of biological material. Though testing was inconclusive, the suitcase itself became a piece of evidence pointing to possible intruder entry and exit. Fourth, there were reports from neighbors of unusual activity that night. One neighbor, Melody Stanton, told police she heard a child scream around midnight, though she couldn't be certain it came from the Ramsey house. Another neighbor reported seeing a strange vehicle parked on the street near the Ramsey home. These reports were investigated but led nowhere definitive. The scream could have been from another house or another source entirely. The vehicle was never identified. And then there are the suspects, individuals who over the years have been investigated, some with disturbing connections to the case. Bill McReynolds was one of the first alternative suspects seriously considered. McReynolds was a retired journalism professor who played Santa Claus at local events. He had been invited by the Ramseys to play Santa at their Christmas party on December 23rd, just 2 days before JonBenet was murdered. He visited the house, spent time with the children, gave JonBenet a special gift, and told her he had another secret surprise for her that he would give her after Christmas. This comment, innocent on its face, struck investigators as potentially sinister after the murder. McReynolds knew the layout of the house, had been inside recently, and had singled out JonBenet for special attention. Further investigation revealed some unsettling facts about McReynolds and his wife Janet. In 1974, Janet McReynolds had written a play called Hey Rube, in which the daughter of the central character was murdered in a basement and her body left there. The parallels to JonBenet's murder were eerie. Additionally, in 1974, the McReynolds' own daughter and her friend had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted. This traumatic event in the McReynolds family history added another layer of strangeness to the connection. Bill McReynolds became a serious person of interest. Police obtained search warrants for his home, seized his clothes for fiber analysis, took handwriting samples, and conducted extensive interviews. But nothing connected him to the crime. His handwriting did not match the ransom note. His DNA did not match the unknown male DNA. Fibers from his Santa suit did not match fibers found at the crime scene. He had an alibi, he cooperated fully with the investigation, and ultimately, there was simply no evidence linking him to JonBenet's murder. Bill McReynolds died in 2002 of a heart attack, his name forever associated with the case despite being cleared of suspicion. His family has maintained that he was a kind, gentle man who was devastated by what happened to JonBenet and who suffered greatly from being considered a suspect. Gary Oliva is another suspect who has haunted the periphery of this case for decades. Oliva is a convicted sex offender with a long, disturbing history of offenses involving children. In 2000, he was arrested in Boulder for possession of child pornography. Among the hundreds of images found in his possession was a photograph of JonBenét Ramsey, cut from a magazine or newspaper. He had kept it, treasured it, alongside pornographic images of other children. A former high school classmate of Oliva's, Michael Vale, came forward and told investigators that Oliva had called him on the night of December 26, 1996, the night JonBenet's body was found. According to Vale, Oliva was distraught, crying, saying he had hurt a little girl. Vale didn't think much of it at the time, assuming Oliva was having some kind of breakdown or psychological episode. But after JonBenet's murder became national news, Vale became suspicious and eventually contacted authorities. Oliva has made cryptic, disturbing statements about JonBenet over the years. While in prison, he wrote letters and journal entries that referenced her death, sometimes seeming to express guilt or inside knowledge, other times being vague and non-committal. He has never directly confessed, but his obsession with the case and with JonBenet herself is undeniable. His DNA was tested against the unknown male DNA found on JonBenet's clothing. It was not a match. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, prosecutors have never been able to bring charges against him. Oliva has been in and out of prison for decades on various charges related to his ongoing criminal behavior. He remains a deeply disturbed individual with a troubling connection to the case, but no proof of involvement in the murder. And then there's John Mark Carr, perhaps the most bizarre chapter in this already bizarre case. In August 2006, a man named John Mark Carr shocked the world by confessing to the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. Carr was a former schoolteacher with a history of inappropriate behavior around young girls. He had been living in Thailand, working as a teacher, and had developed an obsessive fascination with the Ramsey case. He sent emails to Michael Tracy, a journalism professor at the University of Colorado, who had made documentaries about the Ramsey case. In these emails, Carr described details about JonBenet's death, claimed to have been with her when she died, and expressed a disturbing level of knowledge and emotional connection to the case. Tracy, believing Carr might actually be the killer, contacted authorities. Carr was arrested in Bangkok and extradited to the United States amid a massive media circus. He told investigators that he loved JonBenet, that her death was an accident, that it happened during a sexual encounter that went wrong. He said he was with her on Christmas night, that things got out of control, that he never meant to hurt her. For a brief moment, the world believed that JonBenet's killer had finally been caught, that after 10 years, justice was at hand. But Carr's confession began to fall apart almost immediately under scrutiny. His DNA was tested against the unknown male DNA. It was not a match. He could not provide accurate details about the crime scene. He made statements that contradicted known facts. When pressed for specifics about how he entered the house, what he did, where things were located, his answers were vague, incorrect, or impossible. Investigators realized they were dealing with a false confession, a fantasy created by a mentally disturbed man seeking attention and infamy. Carr had never been to Boulder on Christmas 1996. He had no connection to the Ramsey family. His confession was a fabrication, drawn from media reports, books, and his own twisted imagination. He was released without charges and faded back into obscurity, another false lead in a case that seemed cursed to generate them endlessly. The frustration and lack of progress eventually led the Boulder District Attorney's Office to take an unusual step. In September 1998, after nearly 2 years of investigation, District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury to review all the evidence and decide whether anyone should be charged. Grand juries are secret proceedings closed to the public, where citizens hear evidence and testimony without the constraints of a public trial. For 13 months, from September 1998 to October 1999, this grand jury met regularly. They heard from dozens of witnesses, reviewed thousands of pages of police reports, forensic analyses, and investigative documents, and examined every piece of physical evidence. The proceedings were completely confidential. No one outside the grand jury room knew what was being discussed or what conclusions were being reached. In October 1999, District Attorney Alex Hunter held a press conference. With cameras rolling and reporters packed into the room, he announced that the grand jury had completed its work. And then he delivered news that stunned everyone. No indictment would be issued. The grand jury had deliberated, Hunter said, but he had determined that the evidence was insufficient to file charges. The case would remain open, investigators would continue to pursue leads. But for now, no one would be charged with JonBenet's murder. For years, that was the official story. The grand jury found insufficient evidence. Case closed, at least as far as charges were concerned. But in 2013, something extraordinary happened. The Boulder Daily Camera newspaper filed a lawsuit to force the release of the grand jury documents, arguing that the public had a right to know what the grand jury had actually decided. After a lengthy legal battle, in October 2013, portions of the grand jury's true bills were unsealed and released to the public. And what they revealed was shocking. The grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder, but for 2 serious felonies: child abuse resulting in death and being an accessory to a crime. The indictment document stated that John and Patsy Ramsey did unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenet Ramsey. And separately, that they did unlawfully, knowingly, and feloniously render assistance to a person with intent to hinder, delay and prevent the discovery, detention, apprehension, prosecution, conviction, and punishment of such person for the commission of a crime, knowing the person being assisted has committed and was suspected of the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death. In other words, the grand jury believed that the Ramseys had either allowed JonBenet to be in a dangerous situation that resulted in her death, or they had helped someone who had committed the murder. The grand jury believed there was probable cause to charge them, but Alex Hunter, the district attorney, refused to sign the indictments. Without the DA's signature, the indictments had no legal force. In a statement explaining his decision, Hunter said he did not believe the evidence met the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt required for a conviction. He believed that bringing the case to trial would result in an acquittal, and he was unwilling to put the Ramseys and the community through a trial that he believed he would lose. This revelation was explosive. The grand jury, 12 ordinary citizens who had heard all the evidence in secret, who had no agenda or bias, believed the Ramseys were involved in their daughter's death or its cover-up. But the district attorney disagreed and blocked the indictments from being filed. Was this a failure of justice, a prosecutor unwilling to take a risk? Or was it a responsible decision based on the reality that the evidence, while suspicious, was largely circumstantial and might not convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt? Legal experts remain divided. Some argue that Hunter did the right thing, that responsible prosecutors don't bring cases they don't believe they can win. Others argue that the public and the grand jury had a right to see this case tried in court, that blocking the indictments was a betrayal of justice. Patsy Ramsey never knew that the grand jury had voted to indict her. She died on June 24, 2006, at the age of 49, after a long battle with ovarian cancer. The cancer she had beaten in 1993 had returned with a vengeance in 2002, metastasizing throughout her body despite aggressive treatment. In her final years and months, she remained focused on clearing her family's name, on finding JonBenet's killer, on maintaining her innocence in the face of overwhelming public suspicion. In interviews during those final years, Patsy was unwavering. She maintained that she did not kill her daughter, that she had no knowledge of who did, that an intruder had committed this horrific crime, and that she prayed every day for justice. She expressed her faith in God, her belief that one day the truth would emerge, and her hope that she would live to see her name cleared. She died without that vindication, without knowing about the grand jury indictments, without seeing her daughter's killer identified or arrested. John Ramsey remarried in 2011 to Jan Rousseau, a fashion designer. He has spent the years since Patsy's death continuing to fight for JonBenet's case to be solved, becoming an advocate for new DNA testing technologies and for fresh investigative approaches. He believes passionately that the key to solving his daughter's murder lies in the unknown male DNA found on her clothing. John has publicly and repeatedly called for the Boulder Police Department to use genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technique that solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018 and has since solved dozens of other cold cases. Genetic genealogy involves uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, which contain genetic information from millions of people who have taken consumer DNA tests. By finding distant relatives of the unknown person and using traditional genealogy research to build family trees, investigators can narrow down the suspect pool until they identify the individual. John Ramsey has offered to pay for this testing himself, has contacted private labs that specialize in genetic genealogy, and has made media appearances advocating for this approach. But the Boulder Police Department has not agreed to release the evidence for outside testing. They maintain that the investigation is active and ongoing, that they are pursuing leads using appropriate methods, and that they will employ new technologies when they determine it's appropriate. This standoff has frustrated John and many observers who believe that genetic genealogy represents the best chance of finally solving this case. If the unknown male DNA truly belongs to JonBenet's killer, genetic genealogy could identify him within months. But if the DNA is unrelated to the crime, genetic genealogy might lead to an innocent person being identified, investigated, and potentially having their life destroyed by false association with the murder. The Boulder Police Department has faced intense criticism for their handling of this case from the very first hours. The contaminated crime scene, the failure to immediately find JonBenet's body, the early focus on the family to the apparent exclusion of other leads, the leaks to media that seemed designed to shape public opinion against the Ramseys, the adversarial relationship with the district attorney's office. All of these issues have been documented, analyzed, and condemned by experts in law enforcement and criminal justice. Some believe the Boulder police suffered from tunnel vision, deciding early that the Ramseys were guilty and then selectively pursuing evidence that supported that conclusion while ignoring or downplaying evidence that pointed elsewhere. Others believe the police did their best under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, dealing with a crime scene that was compromised from the start, a family with powerful attorneys who controlled access and information, and a case so bizarre that normal investigative procedures didn't seem to apply. The case has spawned an entire industry of analysis, speculation, and debate. Dozens of books have been written, some arguing for the Ramseys' guilt, others defending their innocence. Documentaries have been produced every few years, each promising new evidence or new perspectives. In 2016, CBS aired The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, concluding that Burke was likely responsible. In 2017, A&E aired a docuseries featuring interviews with investigators. In 2024, Netflix released yet another documentary revisiting the case with new forensic analysis and interviews. Each time, the debate reignites. Each time, people choose sides, argue passionately, analyze evidence, and come to different conclusions. And each time, the fundamental mystery remains unsolved. So here we are, 28 years after that terrible Christmas night. JonBenet Patricia Ramsey was murdered in the basement of her own home. Someone in that house, or someone who entered it, struck her on the head with tremendous force, causing a massive skull fracture. Someone fashioned a garrote from a cord and a paintbrush and strangled her to death. Someone left her body in a wine cellar, covered partially with a white blanket. Someone wrote a bizarre theatrical ransom note using materials from the house. Someone called 911 the next morning, setting in motion an investigation that has consumed countless investigators, generated millions of pages of analysis, and captivated the public imagination for nearly 3 decades. The evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously. There are fibers from Patsy's jacket on the duct tape and garrote. There are fingerprints from Burke on the pineapple bowl. There is DNA from an unknown male on JonBenet's underwear. There is a boot print that matches no one. There is a palm print that has never been identified. There is a ransom note written on paper from the house with a pen from the house. Then both items return to their proper places. There is a broken basement window with undisturbed spider webs. There are neighbors who heard a scream. There are suspects who confessed falsely. There is a grand jury that voted to indict, but a DA who refused to sign. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted 2 different ways, supporting 2 incompatible theories. Every suspect has been investigated and cleared or lacks sufficient evidence for charges. Every lead has reached a dead end, and the truth remains locked away, frustratingly out of reach, hidden in the space between what we know and what we believe. If the Ramseys or someone in their family was involved, then we must accept that people with no history of violence, no prior suspicions, no criminal records, managed to stage one of the most elaborate crime scenes in modern history, maintained absolute unity and silence for decades, allowed themselves to be investigated and scrutinized endlessly, pushed for DNA testing that could potentially incriminate them, and lived with the guilt while publicly mourning and fighting for justice. It strains credulity, yet the evidence pointing to family involvement cannot be entirely dismissed. If an intruder was involved, then we must accept that someone entered the house undetected, knew the complex layout intimately, knew where JonBenet slept, knew where art supplies were kept, sat calmly for 20 or 30 minutes writing a ransom note with insider knowledge of family finances, used materials from the house and returned them to their proper places, committed a brutal murder, and left DNA that has never matched anyone despite 28 years of database comparisons and technological advancement. It seems almost impossible, yet the evidence pointing to an outsider cannot be entirely dismissed either. The truth is somewhere in that house, in that evidence, in those timelines, in those testimonies, and it has remained locked away, hidden behind contradictions and uncertainties, and the limitations of forensic science and human knowledge. What do you think really happened that night? Do the fibers, the pineapple, the ransom note, the grand jury indictment point to someone inside the house? Or do the DNA, the boot print, the palm print, The lack of any direct evidence of family guilt suggests an intruder we have never identified. This is a case where everyone has an opinion, where the evidence is complex enough to support multiple interpretations, and where reasonable people can look at the same facts and reach opposite conclusions. Drop your theory in the comments below. Tell me what piece of evidence is most convincing to you. Tell me who you think wrote that ransom note. This is your chance to be part of the investigation, to share your analysis with thousands of other true crime enthusiasts who care deeply about finding the truth. And if this deep dive into one of America's most infamous and frustrating unsolved cases has captivated you, make sure you are subscribed to True Crime Vault. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We bring you in-depth investigations into the cases that refuse to be forgotten, the mysteries that haunt us, the crimes that demand justice. Every week we unlock another case, another story, another search for truth. This is what we do. This is why this channel exists. Hit that like button if you appreciate the depth and detail of this investigation. Share this video with anyone fascinated by true crime, anyone who remembers JonBenet, anyone who believes that even the coldest cases deserve our attention and our commitment to finding answers. Your support, your engagement, your comments and shares, they matter. They keep this channel going. They allow us to continue investigating, researching, and telling these stories. JonBenét Ramsey's murder remains officially unsolved. No one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been charged. No one has ever been convicted. The case file is thousands of pages long. The evidence has been tested and retested using every available forensic technique, and still the mystery persists. But this case is not forgotten. JonBenet's face, forever 6 years old, blonde curls and bright smile, remains one of the most recognizable images in true crime history. Her story has been told and retold, examined from every possible angle, debated by investigators, journalists, filmmakers, forensic experts, and millions of ordinary people who cannot accept that such a horrific crime could remain unsolved in a modern society with advanced forensic science and dedicated investigators. For John Ramsey, now in his 80s, the fight continues. He has never given up hope that his daughter's killer will be identified. He believes the DNA holds the answer. He believes that genetic genealogy, if the Boulder police would allow it to be used, could solve this case within months. He believes that JonBenet deserves justice, that her memory deserves to be honored not just with documentaries and speculation, but with actual answers, with a name, with accountability. Whether that belief will ever be validated, whether the case will ever be solved, whether the DNA will ever be tested using these new methods, only time will tell. If you have any information about this case, even the smallest detail that might seem insignificant, the Boulder Police Department continues to accept tips. Their tip line is still active. Cold case investigators are still assigned to this file. You can contact them anonymously, because somewhere out there, someone knows something, someone saw something, someone heard something. And that small piece of information could be the key that finally unlocks this mystery, that brings justice for a little girl who has been waiting for it for almost 3 decades. Thank you for watching this investigation. Thank you for taking the time to examine the evidence, to think critically about what happened, to honor JonBenet's memory by seeking truth rather than just consuming entertainment. These cases, these stories, they are not just mysteries to be solved or puzzles to be enjoyed. They are real people. Real families, real lives forever shattered by violence and loss. JonBenét Ramsey was a real child who loved performing, who loved her family, who had dreams and potential, and a future that was stolen from her. Behind every piece of evidence, behind every theory, behind every debate, there is that fundamental human tragedy. A 6-year-old girl is dead, and someone took her life, and that person has never been held accountable. That is what this case is really about. Not the media circus, not the tabloid headlines, not the endless speculation. A child who deserved to grow up, to live, to become whoever she was meant to be. And she never got that chance. So as we close this investigation, as we leave the vault on this case, remember that. Remember JonBenet. Remember that justice delayed is not justice denied forever. That cold cases can be solved. That advances in science and technology give us new tools every year, and that somewhere the truth exists, waiting to be found. Until next time, this is True Crime Vault, unlocking the cases that deserve to be remembered. Stay curious. Stay critical. Keep questioning. Keep searching. And never forget that behind every mystery, there is a human being who mattered, who deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who lived and loved and should never be forgotten. Thank you for watching.